partnered together. Me and my aviation finance partners, of whom there are several in the room. We're very passionate about aviation investment into Brazil. Machado Meyer obviously is a Brazilian law firm that, among many other things, works in aviation finance. So we're really happy to bring together. I see a lot of people that I work with a lot on aviation transactions. I see a lot of new faces. So I hope that we can both answer some specific technical questions and also pique some interest in people who might be less familiar with the aviation industry. We've assembled today a stellar group of experts across the aviation finance practice in Brazil. I'll quickly introduce them. Tatiana Barreto is at Gol Airlines. It's the largest airline in Brazil. And she's on the legal team, and I've had a chance to work with her, opposite her once, which was a very positive experience. Next to her is Priscilla Branco. She's I forgot the new title, head of
aircraft programs.
Head of aircraft programs. Yeah. So Azul, fourth largest airline in Latin America, has over 100 aircraft, and she's responsible for all of the planning for that fleet. And so we're very happy to have her up from São Paulo as well. Fabio Falkenburger, I just mentioned, is partner for Machado Meyer. He and I both had the pleasure of being secundees at GCAS, which is the largest owner and lessor of aircraft in the world. And we've had the chance to work together on many transactions over the years, leasing into Brazil. And then Milena Stroppa is here from Embraer. She's on the legal team, and she's come up from São Paulo to give us the manufacturer's perspective on everything here. And then on my far left here is Benoist, Vimal, who's here from Natixis. It's a very large Paris-based bank, but you're here in New York, and you are the head of the aviation practice for Latin America for Natixis, so we're very happy to have you here as well. So, would love questions. So I've got my questions, but I would love it if you guys raise your hand. I'll watch for it. We're going to kind of bounce around different topics. So if there's a topic that interests you, don't wait till the end. Jump in, ask the question, and we'll go from there. So I want to start with, if someone could kind of lay the groundwork for me about the status of passenger traffic in Brazil. I think everyone here knows that there was a large recession in 2014. I wonder if someone can tell us what the current status of passenger traffic is. Is it back to pre-recession levels? And what's the current trajectory?
I can go on that one. No, it's not where it was back in 2014. If you look back, 2014, the crisis kind of began more like toward the very end, between like 14 to 15, 15, 16, just like very, very downturn years. If you look back at how much contracted altogether, it adds up to a little bit over 8%. If you go back this year, last year, altogether doesn't add up to 3%. So there's still a lot of room to recover to get back to the stage where the country was in terms of growth. It is slowly, unfortunately maybe much more slowly than one would want recovering. I think stable is better than definitely contraction. In our industry, I could add, I think demand right now is stable, which is good. It's sustaining, which is good. But I think that's a lot to do as well with the fact of how disciplined the airlines in general in Brazil have been behaving. There was a huge adjustment in terms of supply and demand from 2015 towards now. And that's what enabled everybody to survive. That's what enabled airlines to be on a decent level in terms of revenues right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Hi everyone. I agree with Priscilla. We understand that the passenger traffic was really reduced in the last years, but we also think that from now to the future, we believe we're going to be increasing, especially because we have 2 or 3 years of recession in Brazil, and now we believe that we are going up slow, very slow, but we are very optimistic with the market, even with election and the price of the fuel and everything. But we hope we're going to increase because the market in general in Brazil is going to be increased. That we hope.
And so you guys both sound pretty optimistic. Do you think that the increase is likely to be in the domestic market, or into international routes, or some combination of the two?
Hard to say. I think there's open skies now happening between Brazil and US. Brazil has 220 million people. Brazilians fly very little. If you look per capita, what Brazilians fly today, it's the equivalent of the US in the 60s. Brazilians fly less than Chileans, than Argentinians, than Colombians, and in spite of all that, it's the biggest continental country in the region. I think there's still a lot of unserved, untapped demand, hidden demand, I'd say. I think the country had, again, I'm not saying anything nobody knows, it's factual, historical, that there was monopolies and duopolies for too long. There's no rail in the country, and still people fly very little because they're underserved in general. We do also have infrastructure constraints that could maybe, if they weren't there, could enable growth to pick up maybe faster. But let's not cry about the issues that we airlines cannot directly solve. But I think, on the other hand, if you look at average age of fleet in Brazil, it's one of the newest in the world. Average age for fleets that serves the Brazilian market, it's around 4 years, if I'm not vintage, if I'm not mistaken. So we have fairly young, very good products in the market in Brazil. But I think, again, macroeconomics has to play a role in that as well, to maybe jumpstart growth again. Another interesting fact, historically, the market in Brazil grows at least 4% over GDP. So if we're growing 1%, it's 4%. If you're going 0, it's like 4 times 0 is 0. But it's, again, 220 million people. What an average, midlife American flies 3 times a year, that Brazilian flies once every 3 years. That just to put it in perspective. So there is a lot of opportunities in Brazil.
Okay, question. And that will be for both Priscilla and Tatiana, but I think that Milena will also be interested in that because when it comes to Brazilian market, it seems to me that there will be lots of room for growth for the regional aircraft, regional transportation, because of the size of the country, because there are places that you cannot reach by car or by rail, so it's one flight hour versus 2 days in a boat to reach certain regions. But of course, there has been some discussions on government providing some subsidies to that kind of transportation, which at the end of the day were not implemented. But do you see room for that, and that as a market? And I think for Embraer purposes, for the size of aircraft they manufacture, it should also be something good if this market actually develops. So what needs to happen for this market to develop?
We understand that we need investment in everything, in airports, in legislation changes, such as consumer law, taxation law, and we believe that we have room, as Priscilla said, we have room, we have 2,020 million people, and what we need is investment, and we have a space. I think the last question was if we think that the domestic market is increasing or the international market is increasing. We believe the domestic market is increasing more than international, even because the price of the dollar and everything, and the recession for the last years. But instead of the culture being so big and that we have a space for that, we understand also that with the growing up of the economy that we hope is going to happen, Brazilian people will travel more for international also.
There are places, just again, for you to grasp. We at Azul, we have a very diverse fleet. So we fly turboproppers, we fly E-jets, we fly narrow bodies, and we fly wide bodies. One could call it complex, we call it diverse and flexible. We fly to 101 destinations in Brazil alone. I think Go flies to 40 something. So we get to places, as Fabio mentioned, that you cannot only go by boat, or you spend a week on a bus, or you just don't go anywhere. That's what I meant with untapped land. Transportation is a big enabler of stimulating local economies. There are places that we fly with an ATR turboproper just because that airport doesn't have a fire brigade 24 hours, and that actually prevents us from flying a jet. Just to put in perspective, it's factual. So there are places we did earlier in the year. We made it public. We published a list of the next, I think it was 35 cities, or destinations, not necessarily cities, that would like to fly, that we believe there are demand, there are markets to fly. Some of those places not even have an airport. But we see local demand, a local economy that definitely would, already would call for transportation, and definitely, most certainly would become stimulated. Is it, I'm not gonna lie either, all the places and city pairs that we fly, all of them succeed? Of course not. But again, the fact of stimulation, of how getting a person from one city that doesn't need to go to the other city, but wants to go to the third city, that the fact that it can go back and forth in the same day, that is a huge economy enabler, like growth of the economy enabler. And to Tatiana's point, I think investment and focus will definitely, be a great part of enabling, again, more and more people to fly.
Well, I agree, and I think that the biggest problem in Brazil would be infrastructure, and actually the lack of it. And we at Embraer, we advertise that there are many routes, and Azul is our biggest, one of our biggest customers in Brazil. It's definitely the favorite, the only one still. But there's a lot of room in Brazil and a lot of demand, and that's what we are hoping at some stage that Brazil gets some investments on this part.
And Benoist, I'm wondering if, from your perspective, that infrastructure question is, I know you particularly cover many countries throughout Latin America, and is that from an outside investor's, creditor's perspective, something that you watch and compare, or is that not really something that rises to the level of your consideration when looking to do a deal?
Sure. No, we take that into consideration just in terms of what is the potential and how can this potential be exploited. And this is not a topic that is specific to Brazil. I think that is a topic that is very typical in Latin America, in a lot of different countries. If you take Mexico, Carlos is here, he knows, Mexico City airport is congested, there's limitations. That is the case in a lot of different countries in Latin America. So it's not necessarily specific to Brazil. I think where it's specific to Brazil is where the potential is obviously enormous. I think Priscilla can correct me if I'm wrong, but people forget that I think Brazil is the 5th largest domestic market in the world. And I don't think people realize how big it is, despite the fact that there's still a lot of room for growth because the trip per capita are limited. Obviously, having said that, that does not prevent us from looking at Brazil and seeing this as a country where we would want to invest and finance airlines and aircraft. But clearly, Brazil has to gear up its infrastructure plans to be able to sustain that potential and enable it to be exploited fully.
I heard Priscilla mention the open skies law. So a little bit of background. Since about 2011, the United States and Brazil have been negotiating terms to change the open skies restriction, which put a cap. Most recently, last year, it was 301 weekly flights maximum were permitted between the two countries. And then earlier this year in May, I think they finally implemented it. But Priscilla, the way you phrased your statement, I was wondering, has it truly been fully implemented at this point? And then the question for everybody is, have you seen an immediate impact as a result of that regulatory change?
The way we see open skies is the following: the 300 segments, whatever. Like even if let's talk before open skies. There was what happened is you had the number of frequencies you could do outbound, like generated from the U.S. to Brazil, and the ones from Brazilian flag carriers to the U.S. It's a fact again. There is much more flights coming from American carriers into Brazil, more service than the other way around. And then now we can start talking about, how much it costs, the cost of money, the cost of fuel, taxes in general. Reality is, in Brazil, flying with fuel in Brazil is 50% more expensive than the US. Fact. It's priced in US dollars, it's highly taxed, it's a huge percentage of the, each trip cost, each flight that any aircraft flies in Brazil. ICMS, VAT, local taxes in Brazil plays a big role in that. So when you fly domestically, think about it. When you fly domestically, and you fly, São Paulo has one of the highest, it's more than 20%, 25%, ICMS. Fuel on that domestic flight is more expensive, tax-wise, just tax-wise, than if you fly internationally, because then ICMS doesn't kick in if you fly internationally. So then you wonder, and I don't think there's necessarily a logical, rational, direct correlation to that, but Brazilians love to fly abroad, right? And it's true. Brazilians love to go to Florida. There's a lot of Brazilians, living in Florida, even having second homes in Florida. The same goes here in New York. There's a huge Brazilian community. But then there's so much room and so much potential, to explore flying domestically in a continental country like Brazil. But yet, it's so expensive to fly in Brazil. And then you have all of us being exposed to US dollar fluctuations. You see what happened this year, you see what happened in 2015. How can you have intraday 2, 3, 4, 5% fluctuation, speculation in the currency and affecting more than 50% of your costs? Because ownership of aircraft, fuel, and most of maintenance is priced in US dollars. And then on top of that you have, taxes that vary in the chain depending on which state you are and which place you are. So then you go in and talk about open skies. But Brazil should have a Brazilian open skies for that matter, in terms of, how can you stimulate, internal flying in Brazil? But yeah, going back to the open skies, and this is my personal citizen Brazilian, opinion. It's not necessarily, I'm talking, with my Azul hat on. I think there's so much that in an election year, hopefully, I wish we were talking more about these things than about if you're left or right. But I hope there is more focus in our industry, transportation in general, by the new government, because there's lots that can be stimulated still for the overall growth of the country. And then you have Congress focusing on open skies. With all due respect, and let's have more Brazilians flying let's have more Americans flying to Brazil, and we want that. And United Airlines is a shareholder at Azul. Azul co-shares with United, shares with JetBlue. We fly to Florida, but I think open skies being or not being a reality, I think the concern that I have is that it may benefit more U.S. carriers than Brazilian carriers, for that matter, because Brazilian carriers didn't fulfill even 50% of the quote of segments that it could fly even before open skies. And when you have somebody else flying into Brazil with a different macroeconomic reality and tapping the Brazilian market, I wonder, are their cost base similar to ours? How do you compete with somebody with different cost base, with different exposures and intangibles than ours? Are they going to have eventually an advantage over us flying Brazil? Again, none of this is necessarily has been highly debated as much, we believe, and now I'm talking with my Azul hat on. But again, as a Brazilian living in Brazil and working on an airline, I think there's I wish we were focusing more in talking about what needs to be done in Brazil versus then open skies.
Can I? I completely agree with Priscilla said. As a Brazilian, I know we need to focus in some other matters inside of the country. But also, the open sky is very important for the Brazilian lines, even because it's a tendency in the market. And Go, for example, we have chosen a regular fleet, the same fleet for our business. And then having a partnership with the other airlines and having the open skies, we can reach routes that we cannot reach it today, so we can share costs, share investment, and then we can have a better service for our customer, for example. So we need to focus internally, but I think the open sky is very good for a Brazilian airline to expand our business.
I mean, from a financier standpoint, open sky makes sense in the context of the alliances that the airlines talked about. Azul, United, Gold, Delta, Air France. I think we as a financier view that positively because we can see the link, the synergies. Brazilian airlines are highly dependent on reais, but on the volatility of reais. So as much as they can develop their international revenues, their USD revenues, that makes those airlines stronger. So it's not so much open skies for what it is, but for what it enables them to do and to achieve, which is work better with international airlines, diversify their revenues, and increase actually their USD revenues, which is something that would protect them more against the volatility that you see in the effects at the moment.
Yeah, and just to add, and maybe what Priscilla defined as the Brazilian open skies for the domestic market could benefit from the end of the restriction of foreign capital. I don't know whether you agree or not, but having the end of the limitation on the foreign participation in Brazilian airlines, which is currently 20% of the voting capital, would certainly foster foreign investment that could be, at the end of the day, used for domestic flights more than it is today. So one of the measures that are in the Congress is a bill of law which proposes to eliminate this restriction. And I know there's a big discussion whether it should be completely eliminated or increased, but still having a limitation like it is in the US and other countries. But I think that it would be a way to call for those foreign investors to have more incentives to invest in Brazilian airlines, and which would, at the end of the day, have more funds and more leverage to compete and foster the market. So maybe this could be one of the domestic open sky solutions. I don't know if you agree or not.
And I disagree because the 20% limitation is only voting shares, voting right shares. If you look at the composition, the structure of, even the two of us here only, but if you look at the others, the great majority of capital behind our airlines comes from abroad, comes from the US. There's no restrictions on preferred shares. There's no restrictions on no voting shares. And the voting shares limitation, I don't necessarily think that if you now have 50.01%, ability of having a foreign owning, an airline, in Brazil, will mean more investment in Brazil than not, because typically, companies, hedge funds, enterprises that want to invest, in a business segment, they're looking into the return on their shares, the return on investment, how, as an investor, how much, profit, is being generated, and, a profit sharing and things like that. So, having somebody, come to Brazil just because now they can own an airline in Brazil, I think it's a little bit, it's disguising a little bit of why there's no more investment in Brazil, or more investment in our industry. I don't think the current legislation is detrimental to that at all. And I think looking into, and that's my personal view as well. I think if you look into other jurisdictions and other legislations, it's not typical for you to have unlimited foreign ownership in key segments, and air transportation is one of them. So I think we can go on this for hours. I think it's a very interesting and a very rich debate. But, again, we're friends on a personal basis. We will not necessarily agree on everything, but, that's it.
This is democracy.
Exactly. Bingo.
So one of the things walking into this that I was most interested in was something that probably can't be talked about a whole lot. But I do, on the topic of foreign investment into Brazil, you guys have probably heard the news about a possible deal revolving around some acquisition of equity by Boeing into Embraer. And so I know there's very little... sorry? Yeah. So I know what you can say is very limited, but I did want to make sure you had a chance to give people the version that you can talk about now.
Okay, I got this question even during family lunches. I was at a wedding 2 weeks ago and I got that question in the middle of the wedding. So this is something that everybody wants to know, and I'm the one that wants to know as well. What I can say for the moment is that we have indeed signed a memorandum of understanding. This is non-binding on June 5th with Boeing. And we've been working on a large amount of documents, from operational to finance documents. And our business is pretty much integrated. So Embraer is divided, probably know that, but we have the regional jets, the executive jets, and the military, and we are pretty much integrated. The engineers that work in one project normally work in all of that. So it's very hard to split the company. So this is taking a lot of effort. This is what I can tell you so far. It's being announced, so I can tell you guys that we intend to close the deal, or to have the documents at least finalized by the end of this year, and get the board approval and the government approval, and maybe get the antitrust authorities approval by the end of next year. So far.
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate it. You guys can ask questions. Who else you can get out of her after we finish this? So, Benoist, I wanted to turn to you. I know that you were instrumental in putting together the first WTC in Latin America. That was 2015. And for those that don't know, it is a highly structured financing product that allows airlines to finance their aircraft. And I wanted to ask you if you think the conditions in Brazil right now would support such a structured transaction in the near term, or if there's some elements that need to solidify further.
I don't think there is any legal restrictions to do the transaction, because the transaction has been done. So for everybody's benefit, the transaction was closed in 2015. It was Latam Airlines that issued this WTC financing, if I remember correctly, 17 aircraft across Brazil and Chile. And in this transaction, Natixis acted as liquidity facility provider, depository and joint book runner of the transaction. And our liquidity facility role is very interesting, because basically we're covering up to generally 12 months or 18 months of interest in case there's a default and a problem with the transaction. But in the case of this transaction, because you had a dual jurisdiction, on the one hand Chile and on the other hand Brazil, the liquid facility and the interest we're covering, instead of being 18 months, were 21 months. And the reason was not on the Brazilian side, because Brazil had ratified Cape Town and I guess you guys can talk a little bit more about that, but basically that's an international treaty that enables financiers to get access to their collateral, to the aircraft, in case of a default and a bankruptcy, whereas Chile is, I wouldn't say that it's not a favorable jurisdiction, but they don't have Cape Town, and so that's the reason for the 21 month. So in terms of the legal framework, I think even though there's probably questions around precedents, in terms of cases for Cape Town, I think the legal framework is there. I think it's more a credit question at this point, whether investors would be comfortable to take Brazilian risk, because at the end of the day, they would take a credit risk on any of the airlines issuing the paper. Obviously, it's a secure transaction, so I think that from that point of view, you're better off than on an insecure basis for obvious reasons. But I think everything is in place. It's more a question of how do people feel confident about Brazil. I mean, Azul was very successful in IPO and issuing unsecured last year. Gold has done a tremendous job in refinancing their unsecured last year and the beginning of the year. So I think there is appetite for Brazilian risk. Obviously, during the rest of the year, it's been more difficult because of the volatility and the fuel prices and the uncertainties regarding the elections. But I guess once we will have passed the elections, we'll probably have a clear picture of what is going to be the situation in Brazil. And I think we cannot exclude that there could be revived interest for a WTC, especially when you take into account the order book of the Brazilian carriers. Both, LATAM is I put them in different category because of the Chilean angle. But if we just talk about Azul and Gold, they have a major order book, and I think WTC is a great product when the market is there to finance those deliveries in batches.
Interesting, thank you. So, Benoist mentioned Cape Town a couple of times. Really super briefly, Cape Town's an international treaty. One of the biggest benefits to those countries that participate is that when implemented correctly, it gives some assurances that if the airline goes bankrupt, the owner will be able to recover that aircraft very quickly. But then implementation oftentimes becomes a question. Fabio, I know there were some bumps in implementation in Brazil early on. Could you give us an update on the status of that from your perspective now?
Luckily, I don't think there are any major issues on the implementation. Like there was some years ago when it was like a new law that was incorporated into the Brazilian legal system, because so far we have some very positive precedents on the part of ANAC recognizing the rights of a lessor or a creditor under the Cape Town Convention, and which means that the precedents we have so far is that the creditors are able to exercise the remedies before the ANAC and have the aircraft registered in case of default by the lessee. However, I'm not aware of any precedent in courts yet where Cape Town has been discussed. I don't know if any of my Brazilian colleagues here has any experience, but as far as I know, it has not been tested by Brazilian courts, which, I mean, shouldn't be a problem. It's the Cape Town Convention has been incorporated into the legal system, but my guess is that if and when this goes to Brazilian courts, that there will need to be some level of education to the Brazilian judges, which may not be familiar with that specific legislation concerning rights of lessors and creditors under aircraft financing. For example, the way that Cape Town Convention has been implemented in Brazil provides a specific deadline that needs to be observed by Brazilian courts or in the case of a repossession of aircraft. So my guess is that the Brazilian courts, if and when this happens and a case is brought into court for a repossession, will need to educate the courts and look, the Brazilian Civil Code Code of Civil Procedure says one deadline, but since we're talking about an aircraft, or we should observe a different deadline here, and again, this is something that's provided by law, but still needs to be tested in courts. But other than that, Brazil has made all the correct declarations under the treaty, meaning that Brazil has adopted certain provisions of the treaty that are viewed as positive for creditors, and which results, among other things, to Brazilian being entitled to the OECD discount for aircraft finance. And this is it only applies to those countries that make the so-called correct declaration, and that is the case of Brazil. So I think from a creditor perspective, Brazil should be perceived as a good country in terms of implementation of the Cape Town Convention. But again, it's new, and I think that should happen in any jurisdiction that adopted and ratified the treaty. There are some not only hurdles in terms of implementation, but there's some learning curve that needs to be observed and taken into consideration.
I think it's important to emphasize that even though there have been repossession cases filed since Cape Town became effective, and all of the periods of time that are in the treaty were respected, it's just that we don't know if the judges were even aware of Cape Town, because we had good precedents for repossession even before Cape Town. So I agree with what Fabio said, that Brazil should be considered a relatively safe jurisdiction for repossession, not necessarily because of Cape Town, but we should bear in mind that we haven't had anything that's gone contrary to Cape Town yet.
I'll go beyond that. I mean, if you take Brazilian legislation before Cape Town, it was even more aggressive and better to lessors and financiers.
On the bankruptcy,
Yeah,
especially.
well, and Cape Town came up to sort of grace periods that we didn't have. We could simply go forward and take it the in a repossession access.
I agree. I mean, the fact is Brazil, historically, and we have been involved in some good cases in the past, and I hope that they do not repeat. I mean, we don't like hostile repossessions of aircraft. We want the market to grow and the aircraft to be delivered, not taken away. But historically, the court's rulings and the law, they were all favorable to creditors, and I think that the main feature that was brought by Cape Town differs from what we used to have is the Aéreas, which is a power of attorney granted by the lessees to the creditor, to the lessors, that enable them to go into the Brazilian Aeronautical Registry, to ANAC, and requesting the registration of the aircraft without the need of any court ruling. I think that's the main innovation, if you will, that Cape Town brought into Brazil.
Thank you. So several times people have made mention of the elephant in the room, which is the big day this next Sunday. The 28th is the election in Brazil. I know everyone's waiting about that. So I guess I love Brazil. I try to go there a couple times a year. I'm no expert on Brazilian politics. I know very little about it. So I guess I was hoping you guys could tell me what area would I want to pay attention to after the election to see that, if there's going to be any change that would affect aviation. By area, I mean, is it tax? Is it infrastructure? Is it regulatory? Like, have either of the parties or candidates espoused any strong views that might directly impact our industry? And if so, what should I be watching for if I'm going to be watching for a change?
Well, I haven't seen any of the candidates to present any project for infrastructure as far as the aviation sector is concerned. So that is a concern, because they are not, I see that they are not paying attention to that. But you guys may have other opinions, but so I think we are seeing a lot of polarization in Brazil, and whomever wins, and it will be. This is my personal opinion, and not Embraer. I'm not talking on behalf of Embraer, and so I think it will be. We have to. It's tough to say that. We have to wait and see what will happen.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is my opinion also. We are facing in Brazil a challenging time before this election, and depending on the winner, we are going to see what will happen. I know one of them is more restrictive for investments, and I think the other one could be a little bit more open to listen the aviation market. But besides that, even with election in this sensible time for Brazilians, we understand that we need to focus to be well prepared to any of the candidates, and we need to focus in issues that we have some control. We don't have any control in who's going to be the president, and we have any control with the price of the fuel and the dollar. So what I believe, and I don't go believes, is we need to be well prepared to any scenario that is going to be happy. But we were very optimistic that, like I said, we have been facing difficult years in the last 2 years. So even if it depends on the candidates, depends on the president, we are facing some of the same type of problems, but we are facing also a different methods, I think, of the politics in Brazil. We have two different candidates, very different candidates. That's why we are so concerned about it.
I think one thing sometimes people forget to mention is that any new legislation, pro or against something, reforms that the country deeply needs, depend on the Congress. So I think we can talk a lot about who's going to be president, who's going to be minister, but in a presidential system that's highly dependable on lower house and Senate, and any change in constitution in Brazil depends on a 2/3 majority for anything. I think one thing that we as citizens have to pay attention is who you're voting for the lower house, who you're voting for the Senate. What are these people actually pro or against? What reforms, if any, are they supporting or not? So I think that's definitely, to my mind, as if not most important than who is going to be president, is the changes, the new faces and that are coming to Congress. Again, working in the private sector, I think there's lots of things that the country needs. Lots of talks about tax reforms, social security reforms. There's all the infrastructure. I don't have to rehash what we already discussed here about so many things that the country, could, have, and changes and implementation. So I can only, as a citizen, hope that new Congress is more oriented towards reforms and changes and new legislations that would enable the country to grow.
Thank you. So, whichever person ends up running the country, I'm thankful they're still going to be producing what is, in my opinion, the most beautiful commercial aircraft there is, which is the E2, which is a new family that you guys, the first one launched this year, right? And there's 3 variants, right?
Yeah, the family has been, so it is, the E2 is a family of 3 aircraft. The 170, 70 passengers. The 190, it's 100 aircraft, and the 195, which it goes from 120 to 146 passengers. So we've been on time. on the program since we launched it in 2013. So we believe, and Embraer has done a lot of projects internally to make sure that this will be a very mature aircraft. So we launched Pioneer. I'm not sure if you've seen it. It's available on Embraer website. Embraer has operated the E2 as if it was an airline for a number of hours, a great amount of hours. So feeling how it would be to operate that, how an airline would need the needs of the airline, and how the aircraft would perform. So we understand the aircraft will be, the 190 was, the first one was delivered last year. But this year, yeah.
We're already 19.
And, yeah, we're still in, yeah. And the 195, we are hoping to deliver it to Azul next year. So
Great
it is on time.
Great aircraft.
Yeah,
Coming
it is.
to your home. Come to home in less than a year, flying Azul.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you. So thanks so much, guys. We're going to wrap up with the last question. I was hoping that I could hear from all or most of you. If you were to point somebody to one idea, one fact, one theme, one trend that would make someone be optimistic about the stability and growth of aviation finance in Brazil, what would that be?
There was a lot of points. What was the thing? Well,
And pick any one of them. What one thing would you point someone to give them a reason to be optimistic about aviation finance in Brazil?
It cannot get worse.
I can try. I think, as everyone here agrees, that Brazil needs investment, and I think that during the turmoil that Brazil has been facing for the last years, at a certain point it was proven that somehow the market dissociated from the politics and all the problems faced by the politicians. So that the market and the economy somehow found a way to walk by itself and keep recovering despite all that Brazil has suffered last year. So that is something that, well, there's a concern of who will win the elections, or how the Congress will react to any proposals from the new president. But the fact is that even then, I think that the market and the investors, they believe in Brazil, and I don't see any reason why they wouldn't. So that being the case, I may be too optimistic, but I think that the Brazilian economy will keep its pace of slow growth, which at the end of the day will benefit the airlines and also Embraer and the financing parties and lawyers, and so everyone will be happy at the end of the day. So I think that this dissociation between economy and politics is something that's positive.
I think along the lines of what Fabio said, I would point out two elements. One is the behavior of the airlines during the last 3 years. If you look at what they've achieved in terms of adjusting to the market, retreating from certain routes, reducing fleet, cost management, the amount of money they've raised one way or another. So I think that, and how rational globally they've behaved up until now. So I would point to that, and clearly that proves that you have very capable management teams at each of the airline, and which I think should give a lot of confidence to people to invest into Brazil, into the Brazilian aviation market, because I think you have the right people to enable the industry to grow. Obviously, there are certain aspects that those airlines do not control, but I think they're very good at what they can control, and that should give people confidence about the Brazilian market.
If I may just to add up, I think, again, Brazil is a continental country, 220 millions of people, and Brazilians are huge consumers. Brazilians here in the U.S., and you can see how Brazilians come and Brazilians spend, and Brazil is one of the biggest commodity producers in the world. You have a big chunk of animal protein, that serves the world, comes from Brazil. Of soy, cotton, fruit come from Brazil. There is great industry, one of top 3 in the world from Embraer, huge exporter in Brazil. You have airlines like Benoist mentioned, like how all of us manage to sometimes not even reactively, proactively prepare and plan our businesses for downturns like this and survive, and still are big employers in this country. You have companies like Vale, you have Petrobras even going through the downturns that it had, like resurrecting. You have Brazil is a big can be a big, as I said, enabler of the overall world economy and local economy in Latin America. So democracy works, as my friend here said, like at one point. I'm not that old, and I lived to see 2 impeachments in Brazil, and it was people in the streets like claiming democracy and that things were done, right or wrong. People went to the streets and got it done, and we can agree or disagree on things, but the system works. We need improvements, like I think any country does, and I think us being constructively critical of the things that we want to improve in our own country, it shows how there is so much knowledge and common knowledge in that sense in our society and in companies here being represented from law firms, banks, manufacturers and airlines, that we're all excited about Brazil, remain excited about Brazil. I no longer hear, at one point I remember an Economist cover about with the Christ Redeemer taking off, that Brazil was no longer the country of the future, it was the country of the present. I do believe Brazil is the country of the present, and there is so much in the future that we can still do. So I think what every person here said translates into what each company did to recover from the downturn, the short downturn that we had, and how we're all, each one of us here, trying to bring back to society and do things and expand and support the growth of our loved country. So, you guys here, most of you may live here or live in Brazil. I think there's you can trust in Brazil. There's business to be made in Brazil. There is, very, real conscious, companies in Brazil. And there's a lot of consumer market in Brazil. So, not doing business in Brazil, it's like, why are you doing business back? There is, opportunities, still untapped, as we said, in Brazil. So come to Brazil, let's do business in Brazil, domestically or internationally, exports, imports, or local economy. Brazil is, huge in value, in size, in opportunities.
I have just one more point besides all of they have said. I think the Brazilian airlines is much stronger than the the companies in the past. We're rendering services with excellence, and we are dealing with a lot of political scenarios in the past years, and we are surviving. I think lenders, clients, investors are more confident with the Brazilian lines. So we are all very well prepared to deal with the different scenarios in political or financial, commercial, and what goes wants to make it happen. It is continuing to investing, continuing to give the best service and the best product to the clients, and continuing to give the investor the best financial financial option that they can have.
Well, thanks everyone. I'd like to say thank you to our host, the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for having us. I'd like to say thank you for all of you who showed up, and if you'd please join me in giving a round of applause to our speakers today. Thank you. I'm sure you can grab them for questions before they make it out the door. Again, thanks for coming. We look forward to doing this again next year.
Thanks, Nate.
Yeah.